All right. So welcome everyone this evening to our Garden to Table series, Canning Garden. This is actually our second one we've done this year in 2022. We actually did an in-person one back in March for a group. And so this evening we're doing the canning one because we felt that this would be very relevant to a lot of individuals um, for that are interested in canning. And just make sure that your microphones are on mute. If you do have any questions during either one of the presentations, just go ahead and put those in the chat box and we'll answer those either during the presentation or shortly after our presentation. And so hopefully we'll get to all of those questions and be able to answer them for you. And of course, the session is being recorded and we will share it on YouTube for you to go back and reference or to send the link to other individuals that may be interested in this topic that weren't able to join us this evening. And then finally, just kind of a disclaimer is the information within this class is for educational purposes only. Reference to commercial products or trade names does not imply endorsement by UT Extension or bias against those not mentioned. And I'm actually going to hand it over to Adam Watson, and he is going to get us started, and I'll let him introduce himself to you all.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I am Adam Watson. I am one of the ag agents in Washington County, so happy to be with you this evening. My focus is on horticulture things. So that's why tonight I'm going to be presenting to you on kind of the gardening side of the topic of planning for canning or preservation in general. So we'll go ahead and get started. So whenever I talk to folks about starting a vegetable garden, I always, kind of throw this list up here. It's like, why are you doing it? And honestly, there's a million different reasons. The primary reason for you may be on the screen or it may not. But certainly when it comes to food preservation, it's important to kind of know that from the outset, because how we plant our gardens, what we plant, when we plant, is all a factor of what our ultimate goal is. So when we're talking about canning or food preservation in general, that does kind of inform some of our actions whenever we begin to plan our garden. And I do think planting your garden on paper makes a lot of sense. It helps with things like rotation. We like to rotate various crop families in the garden because we can have a buildup of disease or insects, as well as different nutrient cycling happening if we don't plant the same families in the same place year after year. So that rotation is a good positive thing we can do for a number of reasons. There's kind of two big questions I think that we answer to know how to successfully plant a garden for preservation. One is how much to plant, and then two, when do we want to do the work of preserving? And we'll get more in depth in both of these as we go through the next several minutes. So how much to plant is very much a personal question. It depends how much you're going to use. So if you just think how much in a year would you use of tomatoes, for instance? So if you know you're going through about a quart of tomatoes per week, then it's pretty straightforward. 52 weeks, 1 quart each week, 52 quarts. So if you're really wanting to, preserve the harvest, you need to kind of figure out what sort of consumption level you have and start with that number. So for the example we're going to run through tonight, we're going to use this number of 52 quarts of tomatoes. If you don't like tomatoes, substitute in green beans or something. But so the next question is, okay, how many tomatoes does it actually take to fill 52 quarts? Well, luckily we've got a good reference. And so you see there on the screen, the Canning Foods publication from University of Tennessee. And within that is this chart. I excised just a portion of it, but you can see down there two things. One, it talks about the weight of various quantities of tomatoes, talking about volume, basically. So a bushel. Not that tomatoes are often sold in bushel baskets anymore, but that would be 53 pounds. And so an individual quart is actually only 2.5 to 3 pounds of fresh tomatoes. And so with that little bit of information, we'll say 3 pounds for 1 quart of tomato, Now we can go ahead and do a little bit of math. And now we know we're looking at 156 pounds of tomatoes. That's a good number to know, but it still doesn't get us. Well, what am I planting in the garden? So the next thing we basically have to figure out is what is a reasonable estimate on the production of a tomato in our garden? Well, luckily we've got another reference. And this is one I actually had to pull out of an older publication of ours. Our vegetable gardening publications have been updated in the past couple of years. And I think to good measure and good effect, there's a lot more information. Some things have been expanded. There's better graphics and information in them. But one thing I couldn't find in them was the yield estimates. And yield estimates can be highly variable. And I will say that this is actually a very conservative estimate. So I actually put together a chart, and this will be on the list of references that you'll receive from Elizabeth once the class is finished. And so basically it says that the yield range for tomatoes on a 100-foot row is 200 to 300 pounds. I think that is pretty conservative. And so if we go with that low number, especially, and we're talking about there's 50 plants in the 100-foot row, you're looking about 4 pounds per plant, give or take. And so certainly I think a lot of gardens exceed that number. And so I think it's good to be a little bit conservative on our estimate, because sometimes things don't go as we plan in the garden, whether it's pests or weather or groundhogs or any number of other potential problems. I think sometimes being a little bit conservative on how much each plant will produce is good. So what that means for us, now that we know how much per plant we're likely to get, we can actually take that average yield, divide it into the number of pounds to come up with an estimate of the number of plants. So if we reference back to 156 pounds were needed for those 52 quarts, we're producing about 4 pounds per plant, then we need about 39 plants, and that would represent about 78 row feet. If you want to round up to a nice round number of 40 plants and 80 row feet, you can. The spacing distance is also listed in the reference there. So that's a good one to keep handy if you're wondering how close can I plant things together. So we're looking at about 39 to 40 plants to get our target of 52 quarts. That kind of gives us the quantity or the number of plants we need out there in the garden for us. So the next question to ask is, how do we want to handle the canning out of our garden? So, some folks will just do 1 or 2 sessions where it may take all day or even a couple of days, and they're kind of marathon sessions. They're running the canner, emptying it, running it again repeatedly. Other folks like to run the canner once a week, several times throughout the season. There's no right or wrong way to figure this out. It's going to be whatever works best for you. If you know you're going to have some assistance, you might want to do, a larger session with fewer frequency, but honestly, it's just whatever's most comfortable for you. And the reason we want to ask that question is it's going to inform us on when we want to actually plant and how we want to plant those tomatoes in this example in the garden. So to begin with, we can plant all 39 or 40 plants of those tomatoes out in the garden at once. And what we know is we'll have one big peak harvest from those. Perfectly fine. It's a great way to do it. But we can also plant in succession. And all we're saying with that is maybe you plant 20 plants to begin with, and then you plant another 20 a few weeks later. Or maybe you do 15, 15, and then 10, and you're waiting 2 weeks in between each planting. What that allows you to do is actually shift to where you have multiple peaks happening, because any given tomato, it's going to have an expected beginning harvest, and as it continues, it will ramp up to a maximum and then kind of flow back down to a minimum. And so by planting successively, we can have sort of a peak happening more often, but it's not the huge volume. We can also do some things like maybe just split it up into, especially with tomatoes, because we have the ability to do this, do kind of like a main season planting. So we plant our tomatoes out in this region about the first week of May. You will find some hardy souls that do it a little bit earlier. And some years, certainly you can get by with that. But what I always like to remind people of, and even remember myself, when we're talking about planting things out in the garden, it's not only a function of air temperature or the likelihood of a frost, it's also the soil temperature. And so when we were planting in the middle of April, certainly some years you won't see a frost after you plant, but is that soil temperature actually warm enough? Now, if we're talking about things like raised bed or in containers, those warm up quicker. So we may be able to get things out a little bit earlier. But certainly 1st of May for tomatoes in our area is a good target, and I think reasonable. But then we can also plant again for a fall garden. So with tomatoes, if we're planting, the first week of July or so, we can have a second crop of tomatoes. So maybe you don't plant successively, just have a summer garden and then a fall garden. So there's a lot of different options. And there's not one of these strategies that's actually better than the other. It's just what is going to suit your style. Which would you prefer? The other thing we can talk about whenever we're talking about influencing when the harvest happens is what sort of plants we're planting. And this is really big on tomatoes and probably less so on others, but let me explain it. So here was another reference you'll get. This is referencing some of those planting dates. Let me stress that, where you see spring and fall planting dates, those do reference the entire state. So certainly Memphis in the West is going to be a little bit warmer earlier and a little bit later than we are. So what that means is on a lot of those dates, the earliest would be a little too early for us and the latest would be too late. So given, depending on which commodity we're talking about, a week later, 10 days later than the earliest date is probably a good target for most things. There'll be a few certainly that I think if you put them out on that earliest date, it wouldn't be a problem. But the latest date, kind of the same thing. We probably need to be a week earlier than that latest date just to allow for our shortened season compared to some of the other areas of the state. So this is just a reference to that. It's a handy bit of information. So if we're planting tomatoes out there for canning, one thing that's good to know about those is the day to harvest or the days to maturity. And basically it's just what sort of expectation can we have when we'll begin to harvest off of those plants. The example I have on the screen is actually a cucumber seed packet. But the same sort of information you will find on tags and seedlings that you may purchase. And basically that number is referencing when it gets either planted out in the garden for transplanted seedlings or for things that are direct sown, it's a reference to when they're actually germinating out of the ground. So for instance, this cucumber says 52 days to harvest. That's either from transplant or from emergence in the garden. Most likely from emergence in the garden. I don't think there's a huge benefit to actually transplanting cucurbic crops. I would probably encourage folks not to do that. Cucumbers, squash, all those do great direct seeded in the garden, and actually transplanting those can be a bit of a setback for them. But certainly just take into account, if this was direct sown, we'd have about, as the packet says, 7 to 14 days. If you're planting this, after May 1st and those warm temperatures, we'll probably see these pop out at least in a week. So you can estimate 59 to 60 days, you'll begin harvesting off these plants. So it's a good number to know because it kind of, again, allows you to plan for when you might need to ramp up for the preservation. So if we say all those 40 tomato plants in our example are either the same variety or varieties of tomatoes that have a similar days to maturity, then we know we're going to have a peak harvest, the maximum amount around the same time. That may be what we want. However, what we also have the ability to do is plant dissimilar days to maturity. So lots of times you will see, especially with tomatoes, they talk about early, mid, and late season tomatoes. All that's referencing is just how long does it take before you start getting a harvest off those plants. I should say it is always just an estimate. It's not an exact science, but it is a good reference, especially when comparing different varieties. So if we plant ones that have different ones, so if we plant early, mid, and late, we should see a spacing out of those harvests happening, which again may be what we want. And so we can actually plant everything off at the same time, but by using varieties that have dissimilar days to maturity, then we can actually get that same staggering effect as if we went out there and planted multiple times. So this is kind of a way to get a succession in harvest without doing a succession in the physical planting. So it's just another strategy to get some spacing and to spread out that time period some. Again, it all comes down to, is this something you want to do or worry with? Well, do you want everything to come ripe at one time and do a single event, or do you want multiple sessions for the preservation? You can also manipulate, particularly with tomatoes, and that's one reason why I use them as an example, what type of plants that you're actually planting in the garden. So you will see the terms indeterminate and determinate in reference to tomatoes. So an indeterminate plant basically keeps growing as long as it can. So all season long, it will keep getting taller, wider, bushier. These are the ones that when you put them in a tomato cage, they completely overgrow it. They're falling over their neighbors, but they keep creating new flowers. And so that keeps letting you have new fruit to harvest. They have a harvest that is spread over a longer period of time. And as a maximum harvest, they do have the ability probably to out yield determinate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes typically grow to about 4 to 5 feet tall and then stop. And so that's really kind of a good thing because it concentrates their harvest. So while one plant to another, they may have a little bit lower production on the maximum amount possible. That production they produce, that harvest period is concentrated into like a 4-week period rather than a much longer period for the indeterminates. We'll sometimes see determinate tomatoes referred to as bush tomatoes. So just keep that in mind. If it doesn't say indeterminate or determinate, bush is generally a good clue that we're actually dealing with a determinate. And again, it's not to say that either one of these is better than the other, but they do have different growing habits. And so determinate do have a more concentrated harvest period. And again, that is something that some folks really like because it allows them to basically have more production in a smaller amount of time. And that can be helpful sometimes. So after saying all of that, I know some of you are probably thinking, wow, I didn't know I signed up to do a lot of math. Don't let it discourage you. To be quite honest, if you want to, you can really ignore this. What's really good as a bare minimum for you to do in your garden is to estimate that number of plants needed. And so that would say, what's my consumption? What's a potential yield out of those plants? And what do I need for my garden? And then from that point on, when you have an excess that you're not keeping up with just on the fresh eating side, can them. So you don't have to make this super complicated, although I kind of did. But honestly, this process where you're looking at, okay, what is the output I need and what do I need to get there is really the same exact thing that commercial growers do. They will basically understand what their orders or what the expected sales would be at farmers market. And then they just kind of go backwards from that to figure out what sort of planting needs they have for their production. So this can be something that people really enjoy doing. If you're a big planner, if you really like planning ahead, this may be something that you dive well into. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I also thought I'd touch on, not so much quantities, but also, what should you plant in the garden if you want to preserve? And I think by and large, with the one slight caveat of perhaps tomatoes, there's not necessarily a huge difference between varieties that would be good for preservation purposes, canning, freezing, or whatever, or, just ones we might enjoy fresh eating. So let's talk about, I will mention green beans. If you ever grew up canning green beans and stringing green beans and breaking them, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They didn't have strings on them. You could go through them a little bit faster. So maybe string versus stringless green beans might be another one to point out. But tomatoes, I think, are the big one that really have some differences between different varieties. And, most everyone knows that we have a whole host of different kinds of tomatoes out there. There are a lot of different characteristics, whether we're talking about colors, shapes, sizes. All of those are just, all over the map. Now, that being said, all of those can be preserved. So whether we're talking about the grape or currant tomatoes, the small things, the large ones, the in-betweens, the banana-shaped ones, whatever, all of those have the potential to be canned or preserved. But generally speaking, what's generally recommended is the more meaty type tomatoes, which are often called paste tomatoes, are generally those that are probably best suited to canning. Now, if you wanted to can specifically tomato juice, they probably wouldn't be the best, because one of the things about them is they don't have as much juice as other varieties do. They're actually a meatier type, which is good if you want to make, sauces that have a little more body to them. But if you want a lot of juice, I would not recommend the paste tomato types. So, certainly I think with tomatoes, there is certainly a leaning towards paste types for canning. But again, make sure that, it is going to work for your needs and you're not looking for a juicier tomato. When it comes to other varieties, I scratched my head. I look at different resources and I really couldn't find any other varieties of sweet corn or green beans or different things like that that really made much of a difference. By and large, if you can grow it in your garden, it's going to be good for preservation. So one thing I can't escape from doing whenever I talk about vegetable gardening is just stressing to folks, especially if you're a beginning gardener, fewer plants, better cared for, will equal a bigger harvest. So basically don't take on too much. Certainly, if you do some math and figure out what your needs are, if that's going to be more than you can handle, I promise you that you will have more success with a smaller garden than with a big garden that overwhelms you. And so the estimates of yield in any reference you find are always very achievable if you do a very basic job with things like fertility, irrigation, if you need it in the season, and some basic pest control. And so tonight we didn't have the opportunity to get in depth about any of the sort of basic care side of things, but hopefully you'll find what we did talk about good. And so you'll be getting a big list of resource links from Elizabeth in the email, but this is also a direct link to the PDF. The QR code, if you have a smart device that you are not watching this on, so I know it doesn't help you if you're actually watching this on your smart device, but if you put the camera to it, it will actually ask you to open up a Google Docs link that is legitimate, and it's a PDF that has a whole host of different resources listed on it, both the specific ones from tonight at the very top, as well as basically the whole compendium of resources that I share with folks. You can also take down that tiny URL down there and get a direct link to it that way, or you can just wait for Elizabeth's email. So with that, I will yield the floor for questions. There's my email. Please reach out to me as the season goes along if you have questions, and that's also my office number there. Happy to take a call. If things aren't going right, I can do home visits, so there's no charge for that. So just make people aware of that. So certainly as problems or questions pop up, please reach out. I'm always happy to help folks. And so I think what I'm going to do is, let me take a look at the chat real quick. I don't see any specific questions directed to my portion of the conversation so far. Aha, we do have a question just popped in. So Greg, I'm going to let Elizabeth speak to your question concerning canning pots and flat top stoves. I think she would be better equipped to answer that than myself, but certainly thank you for that question. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to pop those in the chat. I will stay on for the rest of the evening. So if I need to circle around at the end and answer some, more than happy to do that.
Thank you, Adam, for that. And yes, Greg, hopefully I'll be able to touch on that, your question, through my presentation. And so there is a plethora of information about food preservation and canning. And so I am just going to be touching on some of it. And of course, there is information out there for individuals specifically about canning. And then I also have some videos up on our YouTube channel about food preservation that specifically goes into water bath canning and pressure canning, freezing and drying for individuals. But we're going to look at the 10 best practices for canning foods. And so most fresh foods have a high percentage of water, which makes them very perishable. And so they will spoil or lose their quality because of either growth of undesirable microorganisms, either physical damage or chemical damage. And so that's kind of why you have to be mindful about, taking good care of the plants, because you don't want to have that physical damage to the fruit or vegetable, because it can cause some issues in the food preservation process of it. And so microorganisms do live and multiply quickly on the surface of a lot of fresh foods and on the inside of bruised ones, and also insect damaged and diseased foods as well. And so once you pierce that outer skin of that fruit or vegetable, you've opened it up to these microorganisms getting into it. And it actually causes food to spoil quicker when it does have this physical damage to the outside of it. And then also there could be some chemical changes occur in food that causes that spoilage and loss of quality. And so enzymes that help foods grow and mature, they actually continue to work on the food after you actually harvest it, causing flavor and texture changes. And so food also reacts with oxygen and loses that quality. And so we'll look at, when's a good time to start the canning process once you've harvested those fruits or vegetables. So, of course, there's three major concerns of microorganisms in food. And so yeast, mold, and bacteria are the three. And yeast, they grow over a wide range of pH and at refrigeration temperatures. And they do have benefits with this, yeast. It's used in the production of bread, wine, coffee, and cocoa, olives, pickles, sauerkraut. But they also can contribute to spoilage of foods, and they produce many colors ranging from that creamy to pink to red, and they produce slimy spoilage, souring or greening, or produce a fruity or yeast odor and or gas formation. Very few molds actually cause disease in humans, but molds can synthesize a type of mycotoxin called aflatoxins that have been shown to be toxic to some individuals. And so with molds, it's one of those that jams and jellies can be notorious for having. So I get a lot of questions of, well, there's a little bit of mold on top or a little bit of yeast on top of that jam or jelly. I'm just going to scrape it off and eat it. And I tell individuals, don't do that. It's more beneficial just to get rid of that, because if somebody is allergic to molds, there could be a problem, because molds, what it does is it shoots down into the food and has like little fingertips at the end of it that you can't really see. And it's gotten down into the food. And so if all you did was scrape off the top of that mold, it can, and somebody's allergic to mold or doesn't do well with mold, that can cause some illnesses to those individuals. But of course, mold is something, it can be beneficial as well. It has been used in production of cheeses. Blue cheese is, probably the most well-known cheese that you see mold on, that people do eat. Also for some sausages and salami. And it's also been used in development of antibiotics and certain drugs that help lower cholesterol. And so, of course, with mold, a good thing to know if there is mold in the food is that fuzzy looking texture on top of it. Now, bacteria as well are they're microscopic organisms, and so many bacteria are not harmful. Some are even beneficial, and so bacteria are used in fermentation. They're used to make cheese, pickles, soy sauce, sauerkraut, vinegar, wine, and yogurt. And they can be used to clean up oil spills, pesticide control, and production of therapeutic proteins, such as insulin and antibodies. So bacteria can cause spoilage of meat and seafood, milk and dairy foods, breads and cereals, and produce. And they may or may not produce a gas. So they may produce an abnormal odor or cloudy liquid, and they can cause cans to swell and also burst. So that's also an issue. Now, when we talk about home canning, one of the big microorganisms or bacteria that we really have to watch out for is Clostridium botulinum. And the big thing with this one is you cannot see it, you can't taste it, and you can't smell it. And so this is actually deadly to humans. And so it's one of those that I tell it's a paralytic. And so what it does is the botulism goes into a state where it creates a kind of like it creates a spore around it, okay, when it is in an environment that's not conducive to letting it grow. But whenever that spore does find an environment where it can grow, where it likes that, where it's got the food, it's got water, it's also considered an anaerobic bacteria, which meaning it doesn't need a lot of oxygen, that type of thing. And so when that happens, that spore goes into a vegetative state. And in that vegetative state, that's where the toxin is created. And so this toxin is what is deadly to individuals depending on how much you ingest. And so it's one of those that you don't really want to mess around with. Some of the symptoms are very similar to a stroke. It starts on the extremities and it works its way in. And eventually what it does is it actually paralyzes your diaphragm. And your diaphragm is what helps you breathe. And so if it paralyzes your diaphragm, then of course you're not able to breathe. And so it's one of those that you just don't really want to mess around with as well. So I know this is kind of sad, but actually this is a photo of the Gerber family who'd actually died from botulism in the early 1900s because they did eat home canned green beans. So a green bean salad was made and that included these beans. And so it actually had botulism in it. And of course, closer to the more recent type of pressure canning, the home pressure canning is one that will help prevent this. But it also depends on, if you're using those tested recipes, if you're doing pressure canning properly as well. Now, of course, the big goal is your goal with canning is to preserve your food so that it maintains that quality and is actually safe to eat. So the big thing that you want to do is making sure that you use up-to-date methods and tested recipes. And so you can often hear this from extension agents and also the USDA to use. That's one of the big things is what kind of recipe did you use? Was it a tested recipe? Where did you get it? Because they want to make sure that that it's been actually tested and that it's not. There's some recipes out there that have not been tested, and they may not be the safest for individuals to use. You also want to make sure that it's an up-to-date resource. So these here, the So Easy to Preserve, as well as the USDA Guide to Home Canning, and then also the UT Extension Canning Foods publication are three resources that you can use that the recipes in here have been tested. And so you will actually get a link to the canning foods publication, as well as the USDA guide to home canning. And I'll show you here some websites as well about the USDA home guide to canning and the canning foods. But the So Easy to Preserve one is one that you actually have to purchase through the University of Georgia. And they actually are the ones that do the testing for the USDA. So there is what they call a National Home Food Preservation website, and also department there at University of Georgia that does all the testing for these recipes. Now, if you find a recipe on the internet, or if you have an old family recipe, they actually may not be safe, especially if they have not been tested. Now, kind of jumping into choosing that food, you want to make sure that you choose quality food just for safety reasons. And so there are certain practices you should follow when canning foods, as well as for freezing and drying. So always begin with good quality fresh foods. And so examine your produce to make sure that there's no bruises, there's no insect damage, there's no bruises. And so you'll kind of see on this picture as well, there's damage to, some of these tomatoes here. You'll see some that have scars. Adam can probably speak more to this about kind of those scars, but usually what causes these scars here is, it's been really hot. We get a rain, and that rain is cold. It hits that fruit, and it busts open the skin, and then it actually kind of repairs itself back. So that's kind of what happens here with the skins on. You'll see that a lot on tomatoes that happens. Now, after you harvest, the clock is ticking. So you have about 6 to 12 hours after you've harvested to actually preserve your foods. And so this is the peak time to actually do that. So you want to make sure that, once you pick it, you're going to be ready to actually preserve it. And of course, we're talking about canning. So you want to make sure, a lot of times people will pick them in the morning, and they will can a lot of this that day or the next day, just so that they get that peakness of that produce. Now, there are some fruits that may need to ripen, like apricots, nectarines, peaches, pears, and plums, that need to be ripened 1 or more days between harvest and actually canning. You want to keep produce in a shady, cool place if you have to delay any of your canning. And so remember that canning or other methods of preserving food will not improve the quality of or the inferior of that food. Okay. So if it was bad when you harvest it, by preserving it, whether it's freezing, drying, or canning, is not going to improve that quality of that food item. If you use fresh home slaughtered red meats and poultry, they should be chilled and canned without delay. Do not can meat from sickly or diseased animals. Ice fish and seafood are after harvest. And then also can them within 2 days as well. Sorry, Adam kind of went over this as well, as kind of the yields of some of those fruits or vegetables. This is from that publication, the Canning Foods of the UT Extension publication. This is on page 7. That gives you an idea about fruits and how much you'll need in order to get the end product in that canned product. And then also this is from the same publication about vegetables as well. And what we normally tell people when it does come to canning is you want to can only the amount that you plan on eating within a year. Because after that year, the quality of that food is going to start going down. And so it's important to make sure that you don't over can and you don't really under can. You just get that perfect amount. So if it is, like Adam said, if it is that you're eating 1 jar of tomatoes a week, then, making sure that you have at least 52 jars of tomatoes to have for your family. Now, if you're one that eats, 2 or 3 jars, then you're going to have to take that into account as well. So you also want to begin with clean produce. So after you selected the food, make sure that you wash it thoroughly to reduce any microbial load, which is the total number of bacteria and fungi in any given quantity of water or soil or on the surface of that food. So some fresh foods will need to be peeled. So whether or not a food has a peel can affect the processing time needed to kill harmful bacteria. And so tomatoes are one that you typically have to peel before you can them. So most people the easiest way to do that is actually cut an X on the blossom end of that tomato, put it down into boiling water for about 60 seconds. And then immediately take it out and put it in an ice water bath, and it will stop the process of cooking. And then you're actually better able to peel them. And so you can either leave them whole or you can dice them, you can quarter them, you can have them, whatever it is that you'd like to have for those tomatoes. So fruits and vegetables have enzymes that in the presence of oxygen from the air catalyzes the formation of brown pigments. And so you might actually have to pre-treat some of your foods to reduce any of that browning to maintain that optimum color and flavor of that food item. And so sorbic acid in the pure powder form, usually available during the canning season in supermarkets. You'll find it in the canning section. Usually next to the citric acid is where you're going to find it, and it'll tell you on that label whether or not or how much of that you need to add per gallon of water, that type of thing. And so I'm getting some questions there, and I've got a couple. So the cherry tomatoes, typically cherry tomatoes, you don't really have to peel those because they are delicate. So those shouldn't have to be peeled. And yes, I will be doing hands-on canning classes this summer. And so you'll get a link in that follow-up email that will let me know. You just put your name and email if you're interested in wanting to be part of the canning classes for the summer. I usually have one in July and one in August as well. So I call them canning colleges. And then the other question was about the stove tops. And so canning in the flat top stoves. So with those, the big thing about that is the flat top stoves now have sensors on them that actually they will kick off whenever they reach a certain temperature. So that can really affect, especially when you're pressure canning. If it kicks off, it will actually cause your pressure to start falling down. And you don't want that to happen because you have to maintain that pressure that it needs to be at. And whenever that pressure starts falling and it goes below if it's like, say it's 11 PSIs for that particular food item, and it drops below 11 and it gets to 9 or 10, you have to get it up back up to 11 or above and start the timer all over again. Also with the flat top stoves, with water bath canners, especially if they have kind of I call it like the waves on the bottom of it. It's not a true smooth bottom of that pot. It creates cold spots in there. And so that can cause your stove to crack. And so that's why it's one of those that you want to make sure that it's a smooth bottom for that canner. Now the induction cooktops, you have to make sure that your pot is either, it's at stainless steel to make sure that it actually works with the induction cooktops. So it's one of those that even the newer, it's important to call the manufacturer of that stove and ask them, is this something that I can on? And they should be able to let you know whether or not you can on that stove, because there's so many different stoves out there. And so it's kind of hard to say, and that's kind of the general recommendation for those flat top stoves. And even the newer ones that have the coils on them as well, they have also put sensors in them so that they kick off whenever they get too hot, just for safety reasons. Blanching your vegetables, usually this is important. It's scalding that vegetable in boiling water or steam for a short time, and then putting it into that ice water bath. And so this is usually done for those items that you plan on freezing. And so this actually stops the enzymes, which can actually cause that loss of flavor, color, and texture of that food item. And actually blanching will help brighten the color of that vegetable as well. Now, there are some foods that you do if you plan on canning, and this is usually with tomatoes, that you need to add some kind of acid to it, and this is critical because tomatoes are they're on that brink of the pH scale where they are at 4.6, and 4.6 is kind of the breaking point of whether or not to determine you can water bath can those food items or pressure can those food items. And so we recommend either using white distilled vinegar with at least a 5% acidity. And it's important to look at that because there are brands out there that are not 5% acidity, and they don't make it easy for you to find it. And it's very, very tiny on the label. So just make sure that you see that 5% on there. You can also use commercial grade lemon juice. You don't want to use fresh lemon juice because it hasn't been concentrated enough to get the acidity that's needed. And or you can use citric acid as well. And so citric acid is also one, a lot of people like using it because it doesn't really change the flavor of that tomato, where the other two can change the flavor of it. Now, you know, I touched on the acidity, which is critical. So foods with a pH of below 4.6, which this is fruits, you can typically, with the exception of figs, Asian pears, and tomatoes, you typically can water bath can those items. But those foods that have greater than or equal to 4.6, which is typically most all your vegetables and your meats, you're going to have to pressure can them. Now, there are some things that you cannot pressure can. You know, pumpkin is one of them. You know, a lot of people want to can pumpkin butter, but there's not a safe tested recipe for that because of the texture, the density of it. And so that also affects how heat is transferred within the food itself. Now, if you do find something, a lot of people, the most popular things to can are like tomatoes and green beans, those type of things. And usually it's better to hot pack a lot of the foods. And the reason being is you're able to get more food into that jar compared to if you were to raw pack it. You can raw pack it if you want, but hot packing, like I said, you actually get more food in that. And it helps. What it does is that heat helps break up those cell walls and releases some of those air pockets that are within that fruit or vegetable. And so you're able to kind of help pack that in a little bit better into your jar, but you don't want to overpack your jar. So you still need to have some space where you can put down a bubble releaser down into that jar to release any excess bubbles that could be in there. You also want to make sure that you're using two-piece lids and or mason type jars. You know, we're finding out here that a lot of the mason type jars don't actually have mason written on them anymore. But it's important to make sure that you're using mason jars. You're not using the commercial type of like mayonnaise jars or pickle jars, because those are not designed to withstand the heat multiple times. So you want to make sure that you're using those mason jars and those two-part lids. And you can see the two-part lids here on the screen. And I know there's other ones out there that you can use multiple times, but there's really hasn't been any testing done on those. So they may work fine, but there's not a lot of information about it on how well they actually perform in laboratory tests. So we can't actually recommend those currently. And because canning in the past few years has become very, very popular, it also opens the doors for scammers. So, and those jar lids that are not, um, they are knockoffs. So you have to be very mindful of that as well. And it's important. I know a lot of people order things offline. Just make sure that you are ordering off a legitimate website when it comes to these canner lids. And so just be mindful of that as well. Also, these antique type jars, they're nice and pretty. They look great, but they are not recommended for home canning purposes. So you can use them to store dry goods in, flour, sugar, that type of thing, but it's not recommended for canning purposes. And so, and the reason being is because the seals may fail and the food will spoil with them. You can also, there's really 3 different types of canners that you can use for home canning. There's the water bath canner that you can use that's on the left-hand side. That's the traditional one. The middle one, the middle picture is a steam canner, which you can also use as well. And then on the far right is a pressure canner. And this is a weighted pressure canner. And so these are a little bit harder to find nowadays compared to the dial gauge canners that are becoming a lot easier to find. And so when it comes to pressure canning, it's kind of based off of your preference, what you want, whether you want a dial gauge or a weighted gauge. A lot of people nowadays like the dial gauge because they like seeing that number go up. Whereas the weighted gauge, you have to listen for it to how many times it rocks back and forth. And so the instruction manuals, it's very important to keep the instruction manuals so that it'll tell you how many times it'll actually rock back and forth. Now, if you find one, if you were gifted one, if it was handed down to you, or if you found it at a garage sale or flea market or whatever it might be, and you got a good deal on it, reach out to that manufacturer and see if you can get an instruction manual for that particular pressure canner that you found. There is also another type of pressure canner out there called an All-American that a lot of people use. And so that is one that actually has a dial gauge and a weighted gauge on it. And a lot of people like using that one as well. And that one actually doesn't have a rubber gasket on it. It's metal on metal, and there's clamps on it that you actually have to screw certain ways to get that correct seal that you need for that. The multi-purpose cookers, we really don't recommend this to use for canning just because they're fairly new on the market. They haven't been tested. Some of the manufacturers may say, well, it is safe to can with it, but there hasn't been a third-party tester for it. So we cannot recommend people using these multi-purpose cookers for canning, for canning purposes. Also not recommended is open kettle canning. So open kettle canning is the old time way to can foods, and foods are heated over a fire, added to the jars and allowed to seal from the heat already in the jar. And it may seem like the jar is sealed, but if there's not enough heat, the seal will not last and food will spoil during storage, or Clostridium Botulinum bacteria can grow in that jar. Also, one big thing that has come up here recently is people asking about or experimenting canning in dishwashers, ovens, or even microwave ovens. It is not recommended. for canning, because they do not destroy the microorganisms, and the way the heating happens within food, it doesn't actually get the food hot enough for that to can it safely. And if you ever have, if you ever wonder, is it actually safe to eat? We recommend, like, especially with items that you pressure can, that you boil them for at least 10 minutes at a full rolling boil before you actually eat that food product. Once you open it up, put it on the stove, boil it, and then when you do that, if there happens to be any toxin, it'll actually deactivate that toxin because it's not heat stable. The toxin is not. Making sure that you store your foods properly. So the best temperature is between 50 and 70 degrees. And so try to avoid storing canned foods in warm places near hot pipes, a range or a furnace, or in direct sunlight. So if you have a basement, storing it in that basement, storing it in a pantry, just trying to stay away from that heat source, because if you start losing that quality of that food over weeks or months, depending on that temperature, and it can actually spoil your food quicker. So that's one thing to be mindful as well. So just to kind of wrap things up, of course, use up-to-date methods and tested recipes. Choose quality foods. Begin with clean produce. Pre-treat some of those foods. Blanching your vegetables. Adding acid to some of those foods. Hot packing many of your foods. Using two-piece lids and mason-type jars. Processing your food safely, and then actually storing your food properly in that cool, dry place as well. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me as well. This is my contact information. The number that Adam gave you earlier, that's actually the office number. So you can reach out to that number and you can get both of us if you have questions about either gardening or canning that you might have. And so I'm actually going to show you all the websites for that I had discussed in the class. Okay, so this first website here is actually the National Center for Home Food Preservation. That is a really good resource, and I also put it in the chat box for you all. So if you want that direct link, you can visit that as well. This is where I send a lot of individuals to if they need a specific recipe. This is kind of my go-to that I go to find that recipe or answer that somebody might have about a specific food item that they're preserving. The next one is the actual Canning Foods publication that UT Extension has created. And so you can find that on our publication website, but you'll get the direct link to this publication in that follow-up email as well. And then the other one is the USDA Guide to Home Canning. And so this one it's broken up as well into the different types of products that you plan to home can. And then also it will give you specific amounts of, if you're planning on canning tomatoes, like, how many tomatoes do you need, or how many pounds of tomatoes do you need to get X amount of quarts or pints from that. And so that's been very helpful for individuals as well. And then the So Easy to Preserve website is something that you can go to as well to purchase that So Easy to Preserve book. And when I do my canning classes, this is actually part of the fee to receive that. You actually receive this book, and it has information in there about freezing and drying as well as home canning for individuals. All right. So I've gotten some questions about freezing and dehydration. And so, yes, there are on our YouTube channel. We'll give you that direct link as well in that follow-up email to our YouTube channel. I do have a talk on there about freezing and dehydration for that you can go back and reference to as well if that's something that you want to watch. A publication for dehydration. There are actually our specialist is currently working on updating our dehydration publication, and hopefully she will have it done in the next month or two so that we can share it out to individuals as well. But that National Center for Home Food Preservation, they actually have a lot of good information about dehydration on there. If you got specific questions about that too. And of course, if you have questions, you can feel free to reach out to me and I'll be able to try to find that answer for you. But is there any other questions for either one of us? There's so my canning college, I usually charge $100, and it's for 3 classes, but you learn how to water bath can, pressure can, pickling, and jams and jellies is all part of that fee. Excuse me, for the canning college. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Of course, like I said, if you have any questions for us, just feel free to reach out to us at our office phone number.